All right, welcome everyone. This is Marshana Williams, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Workplace Culture at Reach, and I'm here with Dr. Lisa Bates, continuing our celebration of women's history and talking about the amazing women in our community. So thank you, Dr. Lisa Bates, for being here with us. We have like 5 questions for you, so we're just gonna jump right in. So first question, what inspired you to focus your education on housing and community development?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I went to college, undergraduate in Washington, D.C. So imagine it's the 90s, everything that was going on at that
Yeah.
time in cities. I would, Washington, D.C. was kind of emerging from like a very serious crisis with crack, and also just pretty serious instability in the city caused by really decades of terrible policy making and disenfranchisement. The city didn't have control of its own city government at the time. Congress was running Washington, D.C. And I took a job, an internship um, at an amazing organization called Bread for the City and Zacchaeus Free Clinic in their social work program. And so in my mind, I was going to be a social worker, right? I was going to get right in there and help. I was going to help every person. And um, what I found out from that experience was that, in my view at least, the structural problems were people's major barrier, right? So like talking to individuals who were coming into the free medical clinic, night after night, and hearing about their housing problems, hearing about problems with their landlords, about evictions, about rat infestations, just
Mm.
instability, whatever was going on, and how little we were able to do for people on an individual basis, and how much it felt like kicking the can down the road. Like, okay, we can help someone this month, but then what's going to happen next month? They're still in the same situation. And so I was really searching for a way to get, I mean, now we sort of all say going upstream, but that wasn't necessarily the language in that moment that I had access to. But I was like, I have to do something bigger.
Right.
And so housing seemed to me to be the most pressing and immediate, yet big scale problem. And I was had learned quite a bit about the history of urban planning, the
Mhm.
history of redlining, of urban renewal and community destruction. And I could see that very clearly in this intergenerational effects that were happening in the communities in DC. So I was really searching for a field where I could um, practice and make a difference on a higher scale. And that's what brought me into the idea of community development and urban planning, trying to do policy work, but not just from an economics perspective, but like deeply rooted in communities with like place-based,
Mhm.
contextual and relational work to address policy and the structures, but also to figure out how can people be more empowered and more enfranchised to direct what those changes would be. And so, yeah, it was like obviously community development
Right.
is the space for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what has your research shown you about building new models for dismantling like institutional
Mm-hmm.
racism, right? Because like with our history, it almost started with housing, right? Like deeply rooted within housing and
Mm-hmm.
access to housing.
What it's shown me is that it's incredibly difficult. It's
Yeah.
incredibly difficult. It is so here in Portland, for example, the city and the county have pledged, to use equity lenses in the work, to create policies that try to reverse some of these um, historical and ongoing barriers. And I think one of the challenges is that the civil rights infrastructure, legal infrastructure that was created in the 60s, is somewhat colorblind, in
Mhm.
that, you can't combat systemic, ongoing discrimination in housing
Right.
by creating affirmative policies for people of color, even
Right.
though we can look at it and say, oh, this targeted Black people continue to face a disparity here. These policies continue to create a discriminatory impact, but you can't say, oh, now we're going to make a policy that supports Black people. You have to come up with a way to like navigate that. And
Right.
so it's understandable like in the legal context, but then when you get into the policy world or into the actual community, it can be, first it's incredibly difficult to explain that to people. It's like, wait, you just 2 minutes ago acknowledged that you did racist stuff, and now you're saying that you can't reverse
Right.
that.
Right.
So that's incredibly difficult. And that's like assuming that we've all kind of gotten on board and understood what's happening, been able to show and see that policies and practices that appear to be race neutral have a racial impact, a disparate impact for different racial groups. And then can like figure out what's the reverse thing to do, what's the alternate thing to do. So I think one thing is legal structures, and then I think that the next piece is just sort of really convincing folks that there are other ways of doing practices, that there's a lot of stuff that we take for granted as it must be this.
Right.
Credit scores is a basic one. Well, how else would you know if someone is worthy of signing a lease or getting a loan to make a business or whatever, other than their credit score? Obviously that's the only thing that we have.
No.
Right. And so you could show, okay, well, these credit score minimums are creating a huge barrier for Black folks, immigrants, people of color of all kinds to get into housing, to get into rental housing in the market, and to get into home ownership. And yet it's such an ingrained practice, and doing something different is hard. It would take a lot more work to say, oh, we're going to check up on someone's, utility payments or other things that they do to show that they're financially responsible. It would take a lot of work, right? Creating new models and shifting systems takes resources and time and capacity and training and trial and error. And so part of what my experience in research and practice has been is that getting folks in organizations and institutions on board with the project, and then keeping them on board with that project as it begins to actually impact their work life, not just like, we saw our CEO on Instagram say that this is important, but oh, this is changing my everyday work. Keeping people on board with like, what's the North Star that we're going for? In terms of actual impact for people, when we're in the nitty-gritty of like, I have to change my spreadsheet or my data collection or my my intake interview or whatever this thing is that you have to do differently. I think that keeping that energy up is really challenging.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's crazy. I think one of the things we do have to consider is like, housing is a basic human right. Right. And it is not our job to try to tell people how they should manage their finances. Like, it's a home, it's access to a home. And you kind of touched on this next question, as far as like, keeping that North Star. So what role do you see organizations like Reach playing in advancing community self-determination and racial justice?
Yep. So, I think that one of the challenges in the community development field in the housing space is that the models that are funded, the standard operating procedures for providing affordable housing are that, with government funds and some grants, are not really oriented toward community self-determination. They are a different version of a top-down provision of not what you just said, not a human right that everyone has and gets to control, but it's like a welfare program that should be tightly controlled and highly managed, and that people need to show that they deserve to have.
Right. Like
And
regulating charity.
yes,
It's
yes,
charity.
highly regulated charity. Um, and and so I think that the danger and sort of the trend in the nonprofit housing world is to be slightly private versions of like that public housing authority, rather than being a space of communities deciding for themselves and leading the way in the creation and management and ultimately the ownership of properties. And that's a trend in the community development field that's been going on for decades, which is toward organizations that have tremendous amounts of technical capacity to navigate these frankly absurdly complicated systems for
Right.
building and managing affordable housing. I mean, really
Right.
like absurd hoops that the organization is jumping through,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the kind of staffing and the kind of, again, like the kind of technical and financial expertise that you need to be in those organizations.
Mhm.
um and like and I don't say that to denigrate that work. Like that's the way the system is set up. And so
Yeah.
if people weren't doing that, we wouldn't have any of these
Right.
units on the ground. But it gets further and further away from the idea that residents
Right.
would have a significant say in any of the things about their housing and where they live.
Right.
And those organizations have to impose a lot of rules onto the residents in terms of their eligibility to be there
Right.
and staying
Yeah.
there, and
Yeah.
the kinds of um, monitoring and
Mhm.
compliance and kind of surveillance that happens in
Mhm.
those spaces, and without, in many cases, sufficient kind of voice and representation for residents. And
Right.
so, I think that to an organization like a Reach or any of our CDCs here locally, I mean, to really figure out how do you balance, how do you have
Yes.
real
Yeah.
resident voice and governance on the building scale, but also on the organizational scale.
Yeah.
And how can these organizations that have tremendous technical competency, tremendous development capacity that they've built and learned over years,
Mhm.
support people in community-led and community-driven models?
Right.
So, like, how could these organizations lend and extend their expertise to housing models that they don't continue to own necessarily, cooperatively owned models,
Exactly. Yeah.
self-build models, things where
Yeah.
community are in the lead. I think that could be an amazing step
Mhm.
toward supporting people. And I mean, I'm sure that you have heard this, Marshana, here in our community, that for a lot of Black folks here, seeing their community, their neighborhoods in Northeast Portland,
Mm.
um, where there is a policy that this policy that the city has in the Northeast strategy to provide priority access to affordable housing for people who have intergenerational ties, which turn out to be mostly Black folks.
Right.
Um, that the idea of going from, I lived in a home and
Yeah.
potentially even, a family owned home
Mhm.
into an
Mhm.
apartment
Mhm.
rental with, no control over the space really.
Right. Right.
It doesn't
Yeah.
that doesn't feel like a restorative act.
Right.
And it's not just single family home to an apartment. It's the structure of now I'm like talking to a property manager or
Right.
residents
Right.
to be like, what is this?
Right.
It does it that's it's not really it's not really a replacement. It's not really a
Yeah.
restoration. And so I
Right.
would be really encouraged to see organizations think about how to how, again, within the constraints of the system as is, how to keep
Mhm.
pushing that out,
Mhm.
that people
Mhm.
do have that sense of self-determination in
Yeah.
spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I just feel like here at Reach, we're constantly having those conversations around like, how do we still stay within our values in supporting residents and the things that they need while we're operating within a system that doesn't prioritize that, right? Like, how can we, with our size, be that kind of like push and build new models and raise capital to be able to do our own thing without being so dependent on the parts of the system that, create affordable housing? It's really interesting to see how it feels more complicated than even like a regular for-profit apartment
Oh,
building. I'm just like,
it's way
dang,
more complicated. I mean, it's
yeah,
way more complicated.
it is way
It's
more
way more
complicated.
complicated. And I think a lot about, how how do you bring people in from the community into that as a professional sphere too? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
what's a pipeline for people to be on boards of these organizations, to become staff, to get to themselves learn
yeah,
um, things about land acquisition and development and tax credit financing.
yeah, right,
They
right.
can take it to their own communities, and trying to really like diversifying the field, I think, in
Mhm.
affordable housing development and finance is really critical.
Very critical.
It's
Yeah,
really crucial.
yeah.
Yeah.
But even at the resident level, right? You want to be able to build like
Yep.
economic development for residents as well, so they can become independent and understand how the system within which they live in, and how they can like see themselves out of it. But that takes a
Yep.
lot of, it's just so much.
Yes.
So that gets me to the next question of like, how do you stay motivated, in getting through some of these tough times?
Oh.
Because even in this work, I'm like, dang, like I'm tired.
Yeah. I mean, I don't always. That's one thing. I don't always stay motivated. Sometimes I'm like, let me punch my pillow uh, for a little bit, or like really, lie down in a spiral of despair, because it's really hard. I mean, um, and it's a real whipsawing. I mean, described, starting my professional life sort of mid to late 90s in Shaw neighborhood in Washington D.C.,
Right.
where there was tons of vacantly deteriorated property and all these problems, and no one was thinking at that time about, what if this got so hot? What if there was so much redevelopment that all these people disappeared? And so it's like now, going back to that same space, it's unrecognizable.
Hmm.
It is, you couldn't probably get a place to live there for less than $3,000 a month for like a basement studio apartment. I mean, you would it's unrecognizable. And so even just like that shift of what we're talking about is exhausting and
Hmm.
whipsawing. um and so yeah, I think that this is going to sound really weird, because it's like a deeply pessimistic view of life. I know that the systems that we're operating in, the system of racial capitalism,
Hmm.
right? Like a total market driven economy with that's values are determined by capitalism, not
Right,
by humanity,
right,
and is also racist. The
right,
combination of those two things, and that
right.
that makes assigns races a market value as well.
Mhm,
Um, like that system is massive
mhm,
and very flexible and very improvisational. So it's like, I know that I'm up against something that is beyond my individual capacity to undo
mhm.
um, in my lifetime. That
Right.
sounds very bleak, but it's like, okay, perspective. And
Yeah.
also, um, so there's a writer, Rebecca Solnit, who's written a lot about hope. A lot of her work is about climate change in the context of, again, of global capitalism, and like it feels very hopeless to do anything. But she talks about how the enemy of hope, and forgetting that people have, been fighting. They
Yeah.
have won victories. Like there's a million cracks in this wall, this huge wall in front of us. There's a million tiny cracks in there, and that like we have to keep remembering the things that we've done
Yeah.
before. So
Yeah.
I know the system is huge and like overwhelming, and also I know that my own people, like my
Yeah.
ancestors,
Yeah.
had a dream of breaking through that, and they,
Yeah.
have many things have happened um to push us forward.
Mhm.
So just keep continually going back into our history, trying to learn and delve more into histories that have been hidden from us, that have been,
right.
censored or haven't been written. Learning about all the different advocacy that's happened here in Portland, learning about all the different community kind of mutual aid, learning about, people who have been important in this community. That does keep me motivated. And then trying to think not only about the immediate like strategies of like, okay, like which brick in this wall am I going to hammer at for the next 10 years, but remembering to like also think about the vision of the future of when this is gone, right?
Sure.
Like I have to be able to say and see what that is. And I learned that from Walida Amarisha, who's an amazing person who's here in Portland, teaching folks. She teaches at Portland State also, and has an amazing practice of working to talk about like really envisioning that future in the form that we really want. Like, what will it really look like when we have justice? What's it going to be like when we say in our country that housing is a human right, that everyone has, is entitled to, that we will, that we have community self-determination, and like, keep that North Star, not just as like a vague thing, but like really try to feel what that would be like. And those are some of the ways that I try to stay motivated.
Yeah.
I don't like do self-care or anything, Marshana. So
what's that?
I'm not going to be like, I smell some lavender and light a candle. It's more that I go even further into it.
Yes.
I go even further into it, actually.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, we just have one more final question for you, but what advice would you give young professionals interested in entering the field of community development or urban development?
Right.
What would you say before they jumped all in?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So, of course, because I teach at Portland State, I talk to young folks and emerging professionals all the time. And I think that probably a couple things. One is that whatever community that you're practicing in, become a member of that community. You can't stand outside of it and say like, oh, I want to get to learn about the community. It's like, no, be in the community. Be in the community. That's how you know and become part of something, become accountable to other people. It's not to sort of like put yourself into a savior space where it's like, I'm here to help these other people. It's like, no, you're those people. We're we're helping each other. We're part of a community together and creating the community we all want to live in. So I think that's one. And the thing I really work on with my students is trying to support them to cultivate a practice of reflection. Like, how do you really think about those things? Like, what are your true goals? What are your visions? How can you support yourself to get there? How can you get feedback from other people about how you're showing up in spaces, and like really to reflect? Because I do think that, I mean, anyone can learn. You can always take a class or go to a workshop or a webinar or whatever to like learn how to do the spreadsheet pro forma for the tax credit. And it might be hard and you might have to work on it a lot, but like you can learn that. And you can practice in your little practice spreadsheets. But to become a person who can be authentic and accountable and who doesn't get burnt out, and who has a sustainable practice, I think is something that is, we don't talk about it as much. It's not a technical skill, but it's a habit that I think is really important to be in. So, keeping a journal and having a real talk crew who can, that you can kind of debrief stuff with and figure out how to do it better next time. So that you can really, again, with the aim of really being part of the community that you're working with and for, and being of that community, not just near that community, not allying that community, but like
Right.
really be see yourself as part of it,
Yeah,
part of that world and part of that work.
absolutely. Well, Dr. Lisa, that is all the questions we have today. Thank you so much for joining us and
Thank you,
celebrating Women's
Marshana.
History Month. We appreciate you. And thanks, folks, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.